it was ultimately liberal leaders in many cases who brought those conservative ideas into the mainstream, normalized them by virtue of being from the party that did not naturally, was not the natural home for those ideas. It's the Kennedy administration that begins to dismantle progressive taxation, the Carter administration that begins to dismantle economic regulation, and of course the Clinton administration really wholeheartedly embraces many of these ideas. And by the end of the 1990s, I think there's not too much of a functional difference between the two parties on economic policy.
I'm here today with Binyamin Appelbaum of the editorial board of the New York Times. We're here to discuss his new book, The Economists Hour: False Prophets, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
This is quite a provocative title. This is a, how would I say, when you're at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, that contains both shudder and promise. But let's talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. What set you off? What from your experience brought this, how I say, to the place where you felt compelled to create it?
I've been writing about economic policy for about 15 years now, and as I've learned about it and written about it, I've become really interested in how we reached the place where we are now, how our current set of economic policies evolved over time, where they came from. And as I started to learn more about that evolution and about what had preceded these current policies, I just became really interested in that story. It taught me a lot about the choices that we've made, the fact that we've made choices, that we're constructing these economic policies, that there are alternatives, roads not taken, roads taken by other countries in contrast to ours. And I really wanted to tell that story. I wanted to learn that story.
Describe a little bit, how you say, where do you pick it up, in the 40s or 50s after World War II? And how did things change where the economists were able to ascend, and then how were they, how were their methods contradicted by events to leave us where we are now?
So it's kind of a play in 3 acts. There's a first act in which economists begin to gain influence, and that really happens during the Great Depression and during World War II, when the depth of our problems and the complexity of our problems leads policymakers to turn to these people who are bringing a new way of thinking, a new set of tools and approaches, and they lean on economists to manage the economy increasingly, to direct the government's response to problems, even the war effort. You know, during the Great Depression, the economists are helping to figure out where to build the bridges. During World War II, they're figuring out which bridges to destroy, but the point is that they're now in the engine rooms of government. After the war, that gradually increases. We get the formalization of a Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, the idea that the president should have his own economists at his elbow. The first of them are agricultural economists in the early years. And then Heller becomes really the first highly influential person to hold that job in the 60s. That's sort of the height of Keynesianism, is that period in the early first half of the 1960s under Kennedy and Johnson, where Walter Heller and informal advisors like James Tobin and Paul Samuelson really convince policymakers that an activist economic policy can take the economy to new heights. And so that's sort of the beginning of the story, is that the economists get in there and they say, we can make the world a better place. We know how to do this. We understand how the economy works, and we can manage it.
I remember reading a book, I think the author's name was Robert Nelson, called The Religion of Economics. And he contrasted what he called the Vatican of Heller, Samuelson, and so forth as top-down control engineers with Frank Knight, whose notion of radical uncertainty meant essentially you can't mechanistically control the future. And that contrast, Nelson, who I believe was at the University of Maryland, and worked in the Interior Department for many years, sided very much with Frank Knight while being a government economic official. It's quite an interesting tension that he revealed.
I love that contrast. And what happens is that those skeptics, the minimalists, if you will, begin to gain influence as we see this breakdown of the Keynesian moment beginning in the late 1960s. The second act of this play is that a new kind of economist and economic idea takes hold, a minimalism, a concern about government, a sense that it would be better if we took our hands off of the economy and let markets make choices unimpeded by regulation. And much of this book is about that revolution.
And it's a prelude to Reagan and Thatcher. It's
really
a decade or so before. And, I remember it being quite prevalent during Jimmy Carter's administration.
Absolutely. I think today many people have forgotten how much of this preceded Reagan and Thatcher, how much this revolution was really underway by the time that they came to power.
Yeah. And then you see, I mean, various people have made documentaries and so forth about the turning of the Democratic Party into what now is referred to as neoliberalism. I can't remember, there was a BBC documentary in 4 parts and led to Blair and Clinton becoming cost-benefit analysis mechanistic political leaders of a, what you might call economist metaphor of language and leading.
Yeah.
And it was quite surprising how much they, in episode 4, embodied the echoes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister in the High Victorian era, had a very famous line where he spoke of Tory men and Whig measures, meaning that it was often a conservative political leader who was required to bring liberal ideas actually into law and into practice. And I think the opposite thing happened at the end of the 20th century, when you had conservative ideas being the cutting edge ideas, being the things that the direction of change. It was ultimately liberal leaders in many cases who brought those conservative ideas into the mainstream, normalized them by virtue of being from the party that did not naturally, was not the natural home for those ideas.
Well, certainly the growth of derivatives and financial regulation took place during the Clinton years.
But not just that, it's the Kennedy administration that begins to dismantle progressive taxation, the Carter administration that begins to dismantle economic regulation, and of course the Clinton administration really wholeheartedly embraces many of these ideas. And by the end of the 1990s, I think there's not too much of a functional difference between the two parties on economic policy.
Well, certainly, as Donald Trump is elected, they rejected both Republican and Democrats and chose him. So maybe the population started to think there was, as they said, Tina, there is no alternative.
And that's the third act, is that period that we're living in now. I think sort of after what I call the Economists Hour, after that 2008 crisis, where we've once again returned to a period where we have more questions than answers, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of sense that what we were doing wasn't working, even if we're not quite sure what might work instead.
And what's fascinating is the notion, economists were kind of taught to focus on the market as though politics was a separate, mutually exclusive domain. My sense is that economic institutions are, how would I say, interwoven in a way that can't be extracted from politics. But we're kind of coming back to that place where political economy, the governance of climate change, the governance of derivatives and excess, like financial crisis of 2008, the governance of so many things, food and drugs, etc., plays an enormous role in economic valuation. Are we, but at the same time, it seems like what was revealed led to a deterioration on both left and right, Occupy and Tea Party, of faith in governance. What kind of governance do we need to wrestle with this false consciousness and move beyond it?
I'm glad you used the term political economy, because that was, of course, the original name of the discipline, and it captures something very important and true, which is that there is an inherent element of subjective political decision-making in economic policy. And I think, I worry a lot about, to me, the answer to your question is what we need is to use economics in a way that is methodologically rigorous and simultaneously explicit about those subjective choices. There are determinations that we simply must make politically, and we ought to be having public debate and discussion about those choices. And then there are things where we ought to respect the integrity of the methodological process, of facts, of the science of economics, and to say, okay, having made the subjective choices, we will also take advantage of this very powerful system for making choices once we've sort of set the parameters. Both of those things need to happen. They're both under attack. We're both unwilling to recognize the degree to which we are inherently engaged in subjective decision-making, and increasingly we're attacking the usefulness of this methodological process.
When you look at this in the broad sweep of things, do you see people as earnest and innocent and just misguided, or do you see them as actually slightly more pernicious, creating masks to legitimate power? How do you see what's unfolded?
I think people are complicated. I think there was an aspect of this. In the first place, there were real problems. The understanding that people had of the economy in the 1960s, their confidence that as they declared publicly that recessions could now be, managed and prevented,
yes.
was misplaced. And as it became obvious that they weren't telling the truth, people lost confidence in that set of prescriptions. So there was a real problem to which people were responding. That's number one. And I think many of the people who responded to it did so to some degree in the good faith that they had a better way of doing it, that it really was. This was to some extent an argument about how you walk through a dark room. Do you pick a straight line and stick with it? Or do you sort of grope forward and try to manage situationally? And the situational approach, people had lost confidence in it. And when people like Milton Friedman said, no, what you do is you, in the face of uncertainty, you just minimize your activity, you pick a straight line, you walk it as straight as possible, that resonated as an alternative. It seemed like a clear distinction with the way that things were happening, and it had real power. Now, that said, I think we need to acknowledge that this was a convenient argument for its proponents in the sense that it had allied them with corporate interests and with moneyed interests that were willing to support them, that were willing to. There's a very famous paper by two economists, Armin Alchian and Harold Demsetz. They wrote this paper in the mid-'70s about corporations as basically the apotheosis of capitalism, the best possible way of determining how many. If you look at the bottom of that paper, it says that it was sponsored by the Eli Lilly Corporation.
Is that right? Oh,
I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that Armin Alchian in a vacuum necessarily arrives at the same place that he does with the support of the Eli Lilly Corporation. So I do think that we need to be cognizant of the degree to which this approach to economics coincided with the interests of, a powerful and increasingly assertive corporate lobby in the United States.
Phil
a
Morawski's
resurgent
studies
conservative movement.
of Mount Pelerin Society and the role of I think it was Kansas City-based foundation, the Volcker Foundation, played a very aggressive role in even refereeing the fights among the conservative scholars, where Hayek and Frank Knight were distanced from, and Henry Simons was suppressed, while Friedman and Stigler rose to the fore.
Yeah.
So how I say, those influences are very. If you're an economist, I guess you're supposed to think that financial influences make a difference. Otherwise, what do we study? But it does have an awkward resonance in this particular context.
I mean, a great example of this is that much of this ferment is happening at the University of Chicago, and it's at the University of Chicago what we call the law and economics movement begins to gain traction. This reconsideration of whether the law is being adjudicated in an economically optimal fashion.
Yes.
And the first great proof of problems with antitrust is this paper that's written defending Standard Oil. And it's published in the first issue of Aaron Director's journal. Aaron Director, sort of the great proponent of this new law and economics movement.
And his sister married Milton Friedman.
His sister married Milton Friedman. And Director publishes this new journal funded by the University of Chicago, which was built with Rockefeller money. And the first great article in the first issue of that journal is a defense of Standard Oil. It's an outstanding example of, sort of what he was trying to achieve intellectually. But I don't think we can ignore that he was essentially writing a canonical defense of the entity that funded the school where he was teaching.
No, the question is it analysis or marketing?
Maybe both.
It's probably something you have to wrestle with in that context, and in many others.
Economics has had a real issue wrestling with, the question of how we deal with the future. Because when you start discounting anything, you minimize it very quickly.
Yes.
And so, famously, the United States chose not to regulate asbestos not to ban asbestos in the 1980s because there was a determination that the fact that people are going to die 30 years from now just wasn't that big a deal in current dollars.
Yes.
And that same approach has permeated some of the economic thinking about environmentalism. There is a failure to deal with the fact that some things are so bad, some outcomes so extreme, that just as a matter of risk management, you need to deal with the tails of the distribution differently.
Yes.
And I think that and there are certainly economists who recognize this and are speaking very powerfully and loudly about it. But it has impeded, at least to this point, some of our response to these problems, and it has gotten in the way of our ability to confront them as a society.
I'm very enthusiastic about what you're exploring. I've followed you as a journalist for years. We've met a couple of times in the past, and you're bringing a sensibility and a voice and a courage to the table at a time when it's sorely needed. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you.